Hi, everyone. So thanks for coming around to talk, and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about navigating the unknown, tips for efficiently learning a new code base. So before I jump into things, hi, I'm Colin Marsch. I'm an Android engineer at Cash App, where I've been a part of 3 different teams. And prior to that, during my university years, were part of 6 different internships. Throughout all these times, I had to get up to speed fast and learn the code base I was working in to be able to make the impact that I wanted. Earlier on, in some of my internships and early in my full-time career, I was trying to mostly just focus on my day-to-day work and get the tickets that I was assigned done and move on to the next task. But as I've progressed through my career, I've learned that more senior roles require expanding your scope to be able to make the impact that is expected of you in that position. And this is hard to do without deeply understanding the code base around the work that you're doing instead of just the day-to-day task that you might be assigned. So along the way, I've sort of learned some strategies that have worked for me to quickly build more feasible mental models of the code base that I'm working in. And that's helped me sort of figure out a bigger picture of how my work and the projects I'm working on contribute to each other and interconnect. So would have saved me a lot of time if I knew these strategies earlier on, and I wanted to share these to maybe help others who might be in my same shoes. Just a note, as I go through this presentation, I might refer to a code base, but that could just be a portion of a large application. So on Cash App, often code base for me might just be something that's owned by a single team instead of like the whole app, which would be quite large. So now I'm going to jump into my approach. And as I said, these are strategies that have worked for me or I've seen work well for some of my colleagues. And I know everyone learns differently, so perhaps your mileage may vary as well. Firstly, one of the things I really like to do very early on when jumping onto a new code base is to just ask for a walkthrough from one of my teammates. Teammates who already understand the code base, they're one of your best sources early on, even on day one, on just how to get your foot in the door and where to begin when you're trying to understand what you're looking at from the top level. The earlier you can do this, the better, I find. It just gives you a good understanding of a direction to take. I found that when I try to just explore a code base on my own, I'll just pick a direction, try to head in that, maybe explore some classes, go down what depends on them, what they depend on, and just figure out things randomly down one path. But it sort of made me feel like I was making progress on understanding this code base. But at the end, after I've gone through this for a few days, it didn't really give me the results I wanted of having a full understanding of how things come together. It was sort of just like a random patchwork of understanding various things. So reaching out to a teammate can really give you a good guide on pointing you in the right direction if you may have been headed down a wrong one, or just increasing the pace of your learning by giving you a head start on what they already know from their experiences. One place that this really helped me in the past was when I was building a feature on one of my internships and struggling immensely with the Dagger setup in the application I was working with. I had no idea how to get the feature I was working on to even appear in the app, dealing with countless build failures that I didn't understand, going through many pages of Google results, which is usually not a good sign once you get past the first one, and countless Stack Overflow questions that might have been answered or not that just introduced more terminology that I had never heard of before. Things like modules or subcomponents, and trying to figure out all this stuff didn't get me any closer to resolving the issues I was facing. So I asked one of my colleagues to just give me a walkthrough of how things worked, and they were able to quickly get me up to speed in the place where I was able to get the dependencies that I needed for my feature and get my feature back into the application and everything working smoothly. So if I had done this maybe a couple days earlier in the process, it would have saved me and my team a lot of time, as I would have not had to spend as much time without any results from there. Secondly, creating an architecture diagram I find to be very helpful to help get a bigger picture of how things work instead of just looking at a single class or maybe even when you start looking at a code base, everything seems very disconnected. Even if some sort of diagram or structure like this might exist, I find working through it myself is more helpful than maybe just reading something that someone else has made. It just gives me a better sense that I really understand how things fit together themselves. So the way I think about this is that early on, when I'm looking at a new code base, I might see many of these components that seem very unique, but I'm not sure how they fit together. Or another way to think about it is like the day-to-day work I'm doing or the projects I'm working on, I can't really see how those interact and what the end result or big picture is with them. But once I make an architecture diagram, I can see where those pieces fit together. I can see how they interact with others, and I can see more clearly where new components could fit if we're working on some feature in the future that needs to be integrated into our application. So here's just a very high-level diagram of some sort of architecture diagram. But what I like to focus on is sort of at the class level and what the dependencies between these classes are and why those exist. So oftentimes when I do this, I'll run into things where I don't understand why a dependency exists, or it might just be sort of confusing of why something is dependent on versus something else. So one place where this really showed up for me was where I was making an architecture diagram for a code base, and I came across two classes that seemed extremely similar to me, and I wasn't sure why they were both needed to be dependent on. So I dug a bit deeper there and found out that there had been a past migration that had occurred, but was never fully cleaned up, and one of them wasn't actually used anymore and was no longer needed. So I was able to remove like over 500 lines of code there and several files that were just used through that class to save my team the burden of having to maintain those in the future and allow us to focus on other things going forward. Using a debugger is also something that I like to do to learn a new code base. I think myself early on often just would think of a debugger as something to use when I'm actually debugging an issue that I'm looking into, whether that's a crash or something else. But I've grown to like it as something to just give me a deep understanding of the very low-level details of how the application might be performing at a certain flow. Many times when I dive in using a debugger to just mess around on a screen, I find that it contradicts the assumptions I had of how the code actually would behave from just thinking about it before really diving into things. Oftentimes, if I just start looking at a feature, I'll think that the execution path is pretty linear between two things. Like maybe we'll load some data from the network, send that data to the UI, and then display that UI on the screen. To me, that makes sense, and that is how I would assume things to work. But once I dive into the actual code with a debugger, it's way more complex than I expect. Maybe there's a cache that might be used instead of the network in some cases. Or failure cases could come up where we go down a completely different path, sending the customer to a different screen, for example, or things like that. And I'm sure there's many cases that I haven't thought of, even when making this presentation, that I would still run into when doing this on a production application. One case that this really helped me was where I was just generally exploring how the data was loaded on a screen that I was working on. So I set a few breakpoints on some places where I knew there was data accesses, like network and database calls, and ran through the app. But I found that, as I noted here, the order of execution was not what I expected. It seemed like the UI was actually ready quite a bit earlier than the network call was even made to get that data, which was confusing for me as that shouldn't have really been the case. So I took a step back earlier in the process where I knew the UI was just being created, set a breakpoint there, and then ran through things again, going step by step this time to sort of see where things might be amiss. And I found that 2 network calls that were being made, one of which was actually blocked on the other, when they could have been done in parallel. So this load time was roughly double what customers actually needed to experience to see the information that we wanted to present to them. If I hadn't dug in here with a debugger, I likely would have just assumed that this is how long it takes. Maybe things are just sort of slow on the customer's end with the internet connection or something on our back end. But being able to really dive in and see this issue at the fine-grained details, I was able to point this out, and I was able to save our customers this small loading burden. So after going through these strategies and learning more about the code base I'm working in, I realized that that's not really enough to take things to the level of impact of using this learning to actually change things in our product or improve things for my team and even myself and my own career. There has to be a next step to use these learnings, and that can often be done in ways that help increase your visibility and show yourself as an expert of the code base that you're working in. Writing a doc around what you've learned and just the general state of the code base can be one thing that I find very helpful. This can include the architecture diagram that I mentioned before, sort of an overall structure of the code base itself, and maybe some more fine-grained details on intricate, complex parts that you found really tricky when digging into it for the first time, or things that you might think another new engineer might find difficult to wrap their heads around. So this is very helpful for onboarding, especially, and I sort of like to think about it as writing the doc that I wish I had when I was trying to learn this code base for the first time. So like, what was my main pain point in trying to get onboarded? This is something that I've seen some of my colleagues do extremely well. Some of them write a document sort of describing the feature they're going to be working in, how it works today, before making any additional changes to that, just to have a written document that highlights what the before state was, before we do a project there. This has helped our team a lot get up to speed, especially if other engineers have to sort of swap onto those projects and learn more quickly to just be able to ramp up into them fast. But other than just helping our team, it's also helped the authors of these docs. As I said, it helps establish them as an expert in this area of the code base, and it enforces their learning even further. So not only do they gain the learning that they received from just investigating the code base to be able to write that doc in the first place, once this doc is shared with other engineers, often there'll be comments and feedback from those engineers which help them learn new things of maybe some improvements we can be making in this area, or just other engineers who understand the code well might be able to fix some mishaps that were included. Refactor could also be something that you might see as a possibility after you have a good understanding of the code base that you're working in. This is often hard to see early on if you don't have a broad understanding of how the whole code base comes together, and might even be ill-advised to sort of go down that route until you have a good understanding of why things are the way they are today. One way that I've been able to propose a refactor on our code base was when I was doing a deep dive into the code base. I sort of saw there was one place where other teams integrated into our feature. However, it was being done in multiple different kinds of ways, using a different architecture each time. And this seemed like something that we could consolidate to make it more generalized and create better structures just for consistency purposes. So I proposed a refactor of our core data model in that area to simplify these other classes so they would be less unique, and shared that out with my team and the other teams that were contributing to this area. So we went forward and implemented this, and we're able to refactor the additional classes that provided their content to us to be more consistent, and that created multiple new examples of how another team could come in and provide content similarly without having to design their own solution to get into our area of the code base. It was sort of more a cookie cutter approach they could take on. So without diving in to understand this code base more holistically, I would not have seen this refactor as a possibility without first understanding why these differences were there in the first place and why they might not need to be. And my final tip, and one that I think is the most important to take things to the next level, is to just find opportunities that you can use the new knowledge you have on your code base to be able to build things in a better direction for the future. So this can happen in many different forms, depending on the structure of your code base or perhaps even the structure of your organization as well. But in my experience, it's very hard to do if you don't have the broader context of your code base. If you sort of just focus more on your day-to-day work, as I did in the past, I found when people would tell me that like expanding the scope of my work is something that would be helpful to do, it was very hard for me to even like conceptualize like what that could be. Like I don't know exactly what kind of things I could work on beyond these tickets that come across my Jira board. But increasing the scope of your work could include things like test infrastructure improvements, performance issues, some large migrations, or just simplifying logic that might be sort of adjacent to the work you're doing. If you have this broader understanding of your code base, it's much easier to see these issues throughout a bigger lens. And overall, it also allows you to contribute more to architecture discussions on future projects that your own team might take on. So you'll be able to build things in a more elegant way to ensure that your team moves in the right direction and is able to enhance the code base going forward rather than maybe add on potential tech debt in the future. So now I just want to leave us with my 3 main tips for success. Firstly, develop a deep understanding of the code base that will help you going forward. Secondly, document. Write out documentation around the current state of the code base and where and how you think it might be able to be improved in the future. And thirdly, share. Your knowledge will do everyone more good. That's your team, your company, and even yourself if it's shared beyond your own mind, so that it will be a cycle that will just keep on going and increasing the capacity of your team going forward. So yeah, thanks everyone.